Hey everyone, Paul Gale Network here, and thank you for joining me today as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of PlayStation. Yes, it is December 3rd, 2024, which means that 30 years ago today in Japan, Sony released the Sony PlayStation on December 3rd, 1994. Yeah, we didn't get the system here in the United States until roughly 9 months later on September 9th, 1995. But this is the entry point of when Sony officially entered the home video game console industry space. So, congratulations to Sony and all at PlayStation on 3 decades of success in this video game industry, and here's to many more. Now, the inspiration for today's video, beyond congratulating Sony, is because not too long ago I did a cool unboxing video of this PlayStation 30th anniversary PlayStation 5 DualSense 5 controller, which mimics this original controller, and I thought it would be fun to do just that. Look back at the last 30 years of controllers from PlayStation's various systems and give them a little bit of a shout out, show the evolution and where they were and where we're at now. So this is what it all began with back in 1994. This is what you got in Japan. Now this is mine from 1995 here in the United States, but this is it. Corded controller, entry point for the home console, long wire, long cord, thick cord too, good quality build, but relatively simple by today's standards. No gyro, no rumble technology in it, no analog sticks either, and of course, no wireless tech. But you can see there the now iconic look of the D-pad with the splits in between, select and start buttons, no lettered buttons like Super Nintendo, rather figures, triangle, square, cross, not X, even though most of us say X, and circle. Instead of just an L and an R, an L1, an R1, an L2, an R2. If you took these prongs away, it kind of looks like a Super Nintendo controller, doesn't it? For a couple of reasons. On the one hand, when Sony was designing this controller, they did market tests. They looked at what was the most successful system at the time and what was the most favorable one, which one sold the best, and that was the Super NES over the Sega Genesis. Super Nintendo's controller looks more like this, with the D-pad, the 4 face buttons, and the 2 shoulder buttons. So let's add upon that. Whereas Sega Genesis had the 3-button layout, eventually 6. So that's one reason. The second reason, before Nintendo and Sony were bitter rivals in the video game industry, they were partners, almost, working behind the scenes on developing one of 2 products. One being a PlayStation disc add-on that would go beneath the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, extending the life of the SNES, and another, a brand new release dubbed the Nintendo PlayStation, which would be one brand new console. Nintendo wanted to go one direction, Sony wanted to go the other direction. There were some other beef and issues behind the scenes, but it never happened, save for some prototype versions out there in the wild. But instead, Nintendo inspired Sony. Sony learned from their time with Nintendo of how to build, what to build, and with their own market research came up with this. I mean, even the, access point that plugs into the console looked comparable. But this is what we got. This eventually had a DualShock version. Remember, this was 94. Nintendo 64 came out in 1996. And by then, Nintendo had the analog stick. Nintendo had, in 1997, rumble technology via the rumble pack. This didn't. So later on, Sony came out with the DualShock, which added 2 analog sticks right here, and internal rumble. Now, if I show you this is the PlayStation 2 DualShock 2. Missing in between is the DualShock, but basically, look at this and make it gray. And that's kind of what you had with the DualShock. And that was a very important controller for many games later on, as most games on PlayStation, after a certain point, shifted into you need a dual analog stick setup, where Nintendo had the ability to have D-pad and analog from the beginning, from the get-go. Sony didn't. But once it started, it was tough to go back to releasing games that didn't utilize that left analog stick to move around and that right analog stick to control the camera. Was there dual analog stick setups prior to PlayStation's DualShock controller? Kind of, but not as a base. I mean, Nintendo with the 4C buttons had that camera control from the get-go, like in Super Mario 64, right? Day one launch game. And in certain games like GoldenEye 007, you could play with two separate N64 controllers and have this dual analog stick setup, but it wasn't at launch with a system. That DualShock was, and by the time DualShock 2 came out, this was Sony's new standard. So not much changed on the outside, except for them going with black when they released in March of 2000 in Japan and October of 2000 in the United States. But there are some differences. One, the ability to toggle analog on and off. Two, these analog sticks actually added more functionality that to this day is used in controllers around the world, and that is an additional button. Yeah, you have your 4 here, you have your 4 here. That's 8. That's what was on the old PlayStation. But now you have 9 and 10, the ability to click in. Also, something that this controller has, in addition to, remember, the rumble motors inside, is that these 4 buttons have the ability to be pressed and then pressed in a little bit more. Pressed and pressed in. So not something that is really used today on controllers, that additional press, but it did have a little bit something else. 4 face buttons, 4 shoulder buttons, everything else pretty much the same. When we went from here to here, right before this actually was the 6-axis, and I will explain why this is the 6-axis DualShock 3. But they look the same. One more time, here's a comparison before we get into PlayStation 3 territory. But this is not quite what came out at launch with PlayStation 3. What came out at launch with PlayStation 3 was this controller, which is wireless now. Remember, we are in 2006, and this is the era of Wii. The Wii remote, totally wireless. The Xbox 360 controller, wireless from 2005. And the 6-axis, wireless. Now, they're not the first controllers to be wireless. You've got to give credit to the Nintendo GameCube Wavebird controller, which released a few years earlier, but that didn't launch with a system. That was, an interim jump. This launched with a system. That's how you charged it, USB. You had your lights, which player you were, 1, 2, 3, 4. You might notice also that the L1, R1 are the same, but L2, R2 are analog triggers. That's something not here. You can see the difference. So that added some extra practical acceleration capabilities in a racing game and other features in other titles, but that was pretty cool to use. You still had the click. You didn't have this press in deep or anything like that anymore, but you did have this, which was better. D-pad's the same. Relatively safe, honestly. I mean, that has been both a criticism and a compliment of Sony's over the years, is that these 3 controllers in a row, and this one's upgraded model and this one's predecessor model, is that Sony kept it relatively safe. But it also worked on the same hand. So where they were not innovating the whole industry and changing the foundations, adding something that everyone would then later emulate or totally expand on their old designs with something revolutionary, they were doing what was working. But let me go back to this. So when the 6-axis first came out, it didn't have the rumble ability. Sony was not able to use rumble technology in their controller. It was wireless, yes, and it had 6-axis motion control, but that was it. Now, Sony, because they couldn't use it, they kind of scoffed at rumble, like, rumble's out of the picture, it's old school, no one needs it anymore. But that's really them saying it because they couldn't use it. Now, when they were able to use it, and through the patents able to make a new controller, again, that had rumble, they put that rumble back in because everyone likes the rumble in the controller. Or at least you want to have the ability to have it. But this was that 2006 PlayStation 3 controller, though the 6-axis DualShock version coming out a little bit later. And this is where they started to change up the game with their ergonomics for the first time in a long time, from 1994 with the OG PlayStation controller, staying relatively safe till 2006, all the way up until 2013, when they finally changed things up quite considerably with the PlayStation 4 controller. At this point, we're already wireless. You already have the PlayStation Home button, which is what the PS3 controller did, that the PlayStation 2 controller before it did not have. This brought you home. At this point in 2006, consoles are smart. They're smart consoles. You have a home, you have different things that you could do in the menus beyond play a game. I mean, in some ways you could do that previously by playing music, but now it was much more starting to become home entertainment devices, being Wii, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. With PlayStation 4, Wii U, and Xbox One really taking over that. This is a part of your home entertainment center now. Some of us already had it as part of our home entertainment centers, but now, with expanded third-party apps and streaming devices and hard drives and everything going in there, the video games just got bigger and bigger. Some argue that that's not for the best because it takes away from the console design and the ambition behind the games and what makes games better. But some say, hey, it brings the video games into more people's homes, which then elevates the industry in a different capacity by increasing how many people play it, have access to it. So you can make different arguments this way or that way, but regardless, by this time, everything's got a home button. You've got your analog sticks, which feel a little bit different. They still click in. You've got this touchpad here, which you could touch and on the screen, type in your keyboard, for instance, or aim. You have the ability to use gyroscope. You have a light bar sensor here that if you had the addition connected to your PlayStation 4 to pick it up, you could have extra support like that. Back are the analog L2, R2 triggers, digital right there. Started to slowly change up the way the D-pad looked. You had a speaker right here. You had headphone jack at the bottom. Still able to charge it up via USB right there. So if you really look at these two, PlayStation 4, I got to give Sony credit on changing up the design quite a bit. They kept the colors on the buttons, but they more ergonomically took advantage of what you could do with plastics these days, Shigeru Miyamoto once said that a controller's design from Nintendo's perspective is to be a full extension of your arms so that you could slide into that controller, not think about it, and just get lost into it. That's why they actually went with the Nintendo Game controller the way it was, with its L and R, with its grooves, with its A, B, Y, and X being a little bit different than it was before, to really sink into it. Everything was being so definedly different and unique. Anyways, not to say that's just Nintendo's philosophy. Everyone wants a nice controller to be in their hands, but Sony kept it relatively safe for quite a while. 2013, it was time to step up. After all, Xbox One was coming out at the same time, and at that point, then Microsoft was evolving properly from Xbox Duke to the Xbox Type S to the 360, and then eventually into the One, and then they kind of have been staying Xbox One for a while, modifying slightly by the time series. But back to Sony, this was the biggest step yet, but my favorite is this one. Except for the color scheme, I do miss the color scheme because the first 4 generations of PlayStation, the default color scheme was that green, red, blue, pink. And I like that. You don't have that anymore here. But what you do have is a very updated, very modernized controller. You still have what makes Sony Sony, with the D-pad being unique, with a split in between. You still have the same triangle, circle, square, or cross, square. Still have your dual analog sticks. That's one thing that has always set Sony apart, is that D-pad is top, analog stick is bottom. Other analog stick, other side. So you have your D-pad and your face buttons running parallel on that X-axis together. Same here. Same. Analog, same. So since PlayStation 3, they didn't change that. You still have your audio jack there. You've got your PlayStation Home button there. You have your ability to charge. Now USB Type-C. USB Type-C was a big improvement to these controllers. I think they charge up faster. First introduced in the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. That was the first controller to utilize USB Type-C, and I'm glad that nothing has gone back. Oh, I will specify that your share and options buttons here, they make up the same location, but that's a big improvement. Now, there are multiple controller colors of this one, and that brings me up to the latest, which is my favorite. This is my favorite PlayStation controller, hands down. This one wins, or these two win in general, of overall ergonomics, functionality, feeling, button placements, texture on D-pads and analog sticks, touchpad, which clicked all the way back here on the PS4 one, but also rumble feels the best here, more so than it ever has, I would say. Motion control, accurate, as it was on 4 and 3, but it has only gotten better. And the haptics. The feedback here is a step up from what Nintendo introduced in 2017 with HD Rumble. So I got to give credit to Nintendo with the Joy-Cons with HD Rumble, with the Pro controllers with their HD Rumble. This has that, but coming out 3.5 years later, evolved, and its analog sticks, something really special to feel in your hands. When you're pulling down, you could get that resistance. You could feel that jerkiness. It's really neat. I'm hoping that the future of controllers continues to evolve on it. I would like to see analog sticks that have that haptic resistance that, for instance, in a 3D Mario game, if you're skating around the ice, the analog stick is giving a little bit of a shaky resistance, kind of like you're taking a knife and carving over an ice cube, or if you're Mario going through molasses, carefully going through honey, you're feeling it slow, stretching, pulling back on the analog stick. You can feel the bow and arrow pulling back as Link. Now, I know this is a PlayStation primary video, but I can't help but think, well, the next controller to come out is going to be from Nintendo, and everyone is always one-upping each other, Whether you are the pioneer that starts it, or someone that has brought the innovation off of your competition's system and improving on it, or just improving your own. But let's be real, everyone is always looking at what everyone else is doing and trying to one-up each other. One-up yourselves, but also one-upping each other, right? And that's how the video game industry has worked. So where Nintendo released one thing, and then, Sega did something else, and Nintendo did something better, and then Sony came around and drew inspiration, and then Xbox said, oh, we like that from that, and Nintendo's like, we got to do this better, and Sony, this better, and then Nintendo, let's do something new, and then Sony, let's add something new on top and make it better, and then, you know what I mean? Like, that's the reality. That's how hardware works, that's how controllers work, that's how software works. Action games, adventure games, take anything, take any video game franchise, any genre, fighting game, action, RPG, everything. It's always just getting better. We're at such a good point in the video game industry now. How far we have come from this to this. It's mind-blowing. To be a kid growing up with this and then seeing this thing. I like it. I like it a lot. I like that they put the original color scheme from that PlayStation logo. Heck, this one doesn't even have that. That one's gray. So this is better in every way. But yeah, I mean, it does a lot more, but it also looks really slick. And yeah, so that's my favorite controller. I don't know if I touched on it earlier, but ability to mute. That one was here too. Ability to mute. Yeah, right there. So that's it. That's sort of this look back at 30 years. It's kind of wild to think that at one time in 1994, reading about in my old Electronic Gaming Monthly magazines that PlayStation, this new system, came out in Japan, and then in 1995, being there as a 12-year-old when the PlayStation came out here in the United States, being the newcomer on the block, right? To now you think of Sony, you think, that's old school. Man, old school for me, that's NES, that's Master System, Sega Genesis, Super NES. That's the old school, but this is now a part of old school. Even Xbox as a brand, started in 2001. They were the newcomers. After a while, it was like, oh, the industry is, PlayStation, Sega, and Nintendo. And then eventually, PlayStation, Sega, PlayStation, Nintendo, newcomer, Xbox, because Dreamcast was gone after a while. How are they going to fare? And then now, this is the modern trio, which is Nintendo, Xbox, and Sony. Interesting. Interesting how things work. But I'm hopeful that whatever the PlayStation 6 is, tops this one even. I wonder, they've gotten such a good, successful design. Will they risk it and jump and make that next one kind of a departure? Or honestly, just fix it a little bit here and there, change up some color schemes, slightly mold it a little bit differently, kind of like the approach from Xbox One to Xbox Series, They sort of got that refined perfection from what Xbox deems ideal controller. Let's not move it anymore. Let's actually do what Sony did, which was not, shake the boat too much. Unlike Nintendo, changing it up constantly, for better or worse. In my opinion, better. Each one offered something very different than the other, but it was always this evolution too. Although Wii was a revolution, to be fair, but, Sony's controller is so good now and it has everything so modern. Maybe next Sony controller will have that analog stick idea that I'm talking about, that I think Nintendo might have to differentiate itself and to once again be a one-up on this. Maybe Nintendo won't do it. Maybe Microsoft will. Maybe they won't. Maybe it will be Sony. Maybe I'll be playing as Aloy in the future and utilizing this as her bow and arrow. You know what I mean? Maybe I'll be Kratos and I'll have to, go through the waters and stuff like that with, an oar on either way. And when I hit the rock on this side of the boat, the analog stick is going to give in a little bit here or there, right? Maybe I'll be playing a future Ratchet and Clank game or a future Spider-Man game, and I have to do something with these two analog sticks, whether it's rotating in really quickly because I'm trying to capture a bad guy with a spider web, and it's getting harder and harder, and the analog stick is pulling in the opposite direction because that foe is pulling me and I'm pulling this person back. Or in Ratchet and Clank, I have, an electric gun of some sort, and I have to make it shake, make the beam from two different sides of my arm cannon here and my gun here or something like that, have the two bind together, and it's jittering back and forth. Maybe it'll be Sony that does it. Maybe no one does it. It would be a shame if no one does it, because I think that's the next step in control. I'm getting excited. It's pretty awesome to think about it. Anyways, this video went from being a congratulations PlayStation on 30 years in the industry video to showing you off all these controllers to me having ideas of what I would like to see next. But with that being said, congrats one more time. Happy 30th anniversary. Thank you for your contributions. And here's, like I said, to another 30 years. Let's see what the future has in store. All right. Have a good one, everyone. PGN signing out. Thanks for watching. Bye.